Brave New World by Aldous Huxley. Chapter 1. A squat gray building of only 34 stories over the main entrance, the word Central London Hatchery and Conditioning Center, and in a shield, the World State's motto, Community, Identity, Stability. The enormous room on the ground floor faced toward the north, cold from all the summer beyond the panes. For all the tropical heat of the room itself, a harsh thin light glared through the windows, hungrily seeking some draped lay figure, some pallid shape of academic gooseflesh, but finding only the glass and nickel and bleakly shining porcelain of a laboratory. Winteriness responds to winteriness. The overalls of the workers were white, their hands gloved with a pale, corpse-colored rubber. The light was frozen, dead, a ghost. Only for the yellow barrels of the microscopes did it borrow a certain rich and lively substance. Lying along the polished tubes like butter, streak after luscious streak, in long recession down the work tables. And this, said the director, opening the door, is the fertilizing room. Bent over their instruments, 300 fertilizers were plunged as the director of hatcheries and conditioning entered the room in the scarcely breathing silence, the absent-minded, soliloquizing hum of whistle of absorbed concentration. A troop of newly arrived students, very young and pink and callow, followed nervously, rather abjectly, at the director's heels, each of them carrying a notebook in which, whenever the great man spoke, he desperately scribbled. Straight from the horse's mouth, it was a rare privilege. The DHC for Central London always made a point of personally conducting his new students round the various departments. Just to give you a general idea, he would explain to them, for of course some sort of general idea they must have, if they were to do their work intelligently, though as little of one, if they were to be found and happy members of the society as possible. For particulars, as every one knows, make for virtue and happiness. Generalities are intellectually necessary evils. Not philosophers nor fret-sayers and stamp collectors compose the back. Sorry, not philosophers, but fret-sayers and stamp collectors compose the backbone of society. Tomorrow, he would add, smiling at them with a slightly menacing geniality, you'll be settling down to serious work. You won't have time for generalities. Meanwhile, it was a privilege. Straight from the horse's mouth into the notebook, the boys scribbled like mad. Tall and rather thin, but upright, the director advanced into the room. He had a long chin and big, rather prominent teeth, just covered, when he was not talking, by his full, floridly curved lips. Old, young, 30, 50, 55? It was hard to say. And anyhow, the question didn't arise in this year of stability. AF 632. It didn't occur to you to ask. I shall begin at the beginning, said the DHC, and the most zealous students recorded his intention in their notebooks. Begin at the beginning. These, he waved his hand, are the incubators. And opening an insulated door, he showed them racks upon racks of numbered test tubes. The week's supply of ova, kept, he explained, at blood heat, whereas the male gametes, and here he opened another drawer, they have to be kept at 35 instead of 47. Full blood heat sterilizes. Rams wrapped in thermogene beget no lambs. Still, leaning against the incubators, he gave them, while the pencils scurried ineligibly across the pages, a brief description of the modern fertilization process. Spoke first, of course, of its surgical introduction. The operation undergone voluntarily for the good of society, not to mention the fact that it carries a bonus amounting to 6 months' salary, continued with some account of the technique for preserving the excised ovary alive and actively developing, passed on to a consideration of optimum temperature, salinity, viscosity, transferred to the liquor in which the detached and ripened eggs were kept, and leading his charges to the work table, actually showed them how this liquor was drawn off from the test tubes, how it was let out drop by drop onto the specially warmed slides of the microscope, how the eggs which it contained were inspected for abnormalities, counted and transferred to a porous receptacle, how, and he now took them to watch the operation, this receptacle was immersed in a warm bouillon containing free-swimming spermatozoa at a minimum concentration of 100,000 per cubic centimeter. He insisted, and how, after 10 minutes, the container was lifted out of the liqueur and its contents were re-examined. How, if any of the eggs remained unfertilized, it was again immersed, and if necessary, yet again, how the fertilized ova went back to the incubator, where the alphas and betas remained until definitely bottled, while the gammas, deltas, and epsilons were brought out again after only 36 hours to undergo Bokanovsky's process. Bokanovsky's process, repeated the director, and the students underlined the words in their little notebooks. One egg, one embryo, one adult. Normality. But a Bokanovskified egg will bud, will proliferate, will divide from 8 to 96 buds, and every bud will grow into a perfectly formed embryo, and every embryo into a full-sized adult, making 96 human beings grow where only one grew before. Progress. Essentially, the DHC concluded, Bokanovskification consists of a series of arrests of development. We check the normal growth, and paradoxically enough, the eggs respond by budding. Responds by budding. The pencils were busy. He pointed on a very slowly moving band of a rackful of test tubes were entering a large metal box. Another rackful was emerging. Machinery faintly purred. It took 8 minutes for the tubes to go through, he told them. 8 minutes of hard X-rays, being about as much as an egg can stand. A few died. Of the rest, the least susceptible divided into two, but most put out 4 buds, some 8. All will return to the incubator where the buds began to develop. Then, after 2 days, were suddenly chilled, and checked. 2, 4, 8, the buds in their turn budded, and having budded, were dosed almost to death with alcohol, consequently burgeoned again, and having budded, bud out of bud, were thereafter, further arrest being generally fatal, left to develop in peace. By which time the original egg was still in a fair way to becoming anything from 8 to 96 embryos, a prodigious improvement, you will agree, on nature. Identical twins, but not in piddling 2s or 3s, as the old uh, viviparous days, when an egg would sometimes accidentally divide, actually by dozens, by scores at a time. Scores, the director repeated, and flung out his arms, as though he were distributing largesse. Scores! And one of the students was fool enough to ask where the advantage lay. My good boy, the director wheeled sharply around on him. Can't you see? Can't you see? He raised a hand. His expression was solemn. Bokanovsky's process is one of the major instruments of social stability. Major instruments of social stability. Standard men and women in uniform batches, the whole of a small factory, with the products of a single Bokanovskified egg. Bokanovskified egg. 96 identical twins working 96 identical machines. The voices were almost tremulous with enthusiasm. You really know where you are. For the first time in history, he quoted the planetary motto, community. Sorry, you really know where you are. For the first time in history, he quoted the planetary motto, community, identity, stability. Grand words. If we would Bokinoskify indefinitely, the whole problem would be solved. Solved by standard gammas, unvarying deltas, uniform epsilons, millions of identical twins. The principle of mass production at last applied to biology. But alas, the director shook his head, we can't Bokinoskify indefinitely. 96 seemed to be the limit, 72 a good average. From the same ovary and with gametes of the same male to manufacture as many batches of identical twins as possible. That was the best, sadly a second best, that they could do. And even that was difficult. For in nature it takes 30 years for 200 eggs to reach maturity, but our business is to stabilize the population at this moment here and now. Dribbling out twins over a quarter century, what would be the use of that? Obviously, no use at all. But Podsnap's technique had immensely accelerated the process of ripening. They could make sure of at least 250 mature eggs within 2 years. Fertilize and Balkanovskified. I have to make sure I'm saying that right. Balkanovskified. In other words, multiplying by 72. And you get an average of nearly 11,000 brothers and sisters in 150 batches of identical twins, all within 2 years of the same age. And in exceptional cases, we can make one ovary yield us over 10,000 individual adult individuals. Beckoning to a fair-haired, ruddy young man who happened to be passing at the moment, Mr. Foster, he called. The ruddy young man approached. Can you tell us the record for a single ovary, Mr. Foster? 16,012 in this center, Mr. Foster replied without hesitation. He spoke very quickly, had a vivacious blue eye, and took an evident pleasure in quoting figures. 16,012 in 189 batches of identicals. But of course, we've done much better, he rattled on. In some of the tropical centers, Singapore has often produced over 16,500, and Mombasa has actually touched the 17,000 mark. But even then, they have unfair advantages. You should see the way a Negro ovary responds to pituitary. It's quite astonishing when you're used to working with European material. Still, he added with a laugh, but the light of combat was in his eyes, and the lift of his chin was challenging. Still, we mean to beat them if we can. I'm working on a wonderful delta minus ovary at the moment, only just 18 months old. Over 12,700 children already, either decanted or an embryo, and still going strong. We'll beat them yet. That's the spirit I like, cried the director, and clapped Mr. Foster on the shoulder. Come along with us and give these boys the benefit of your expert knowledge. Mr. Foster smiled modestly. With pleasure, they went. In the bottling room, all was harmonious bustle and ordered activity. Flapping a fresh sowed pretinomium, ready cut to the proper size, came shooting up in little lifts from the organ store in the sub-basement. Whiz, and then click, the lift hatches flew open. The bottle liner had only to reach out a hand, take the flap insert smooth down, and before the lined bottle had had time to travel out of reach along the endless band, whiz, clack, another flap of peritonium had shot up from the depths, ready to be slipped into yet another bottle. And next of that slow, interminable process on the band. Next to the liners stood the matriculators. The procession advanced. One by one, the eggs were transferred from the test tube to the larger containers. Deftly, the peritoneal lining was slit. The morula dropped into place. The saline solution poured in, and already the bottle had passed. and it was the turn of the labelers. Heredity, date of fertilization, member of Bokanowski group. Details were transferred from the test tube to bottle. No longer anonymous but named, identified, the procession marched slowly on through an opening in the wall, slowly on into the social predestination room. 88 cubic meters of index cards, said Mr. Foster with relish as they entered. Containing all the relevant information, added the director. Brought up to date every morning and coordinated every afternoon, on the basis of which they make their circulations. So many individuals, or such, of such and such quality, said Mr. Foster. Distributed and such quantities, the optimum decanting rate at any given moment. Unforeseen wasted, promptly made good. Promptly, repeated Mr. Foster. If you knew the amount of overtime I had to put in after the last Japanese earthquake, he laughed good-humoredly and shook his head. The predestinators send in their figures to the fertilizers, who give them the embryos they ask for. And the bottles come in here to be predestined in detail, after which they are sent down to the embryo store, where we are now processed ourselves. At the opening And opening a door, Mr. Foster led the way down a staircase into the basement. The temperature was still tropical. They descended into a thickening twilight. 2 doors and a passage with a double turn ensured the cellar against any possible infiltration of the day. Embryos are like photograph film, said Mr. Foster waggishly, as he pushed open the second door. They can only stand red light, and in effect the sultry darkness into which the students now followed him was visible in crimson like the darkness of closed eyes on a summer's afternoon. The bulging flanks of row and rescending row and tier above tier of bottles glinted with innumerable rubies, and among the rubies moved the dim red spectre of men and women with purple eyes, and all the symptoms of lupus. The hum and rattle of machinery faintly stirred the air. Give them a few figures, Mr. Foster, said the director, who was tired of talking. Mr. Foster was only too happy to give them a few figures. 220 meters long, 200 wide, 10 high. He pointed upward like chickens drinking. The students lifted their eyes toward the distant ceiling. 3 tiers of racks, ground level, first gallery, second gallery. The spidery steelwork of gallery above gallery faded away in all directions into the dark. Near them, 3 red ghosts were busily uploading demijohns from a moving staircase, the escalator from the social predestination room. Each bottle could be placed on one of 15 racks. Each rack, though you couldn't see it, was a conveyor traveling at the rate of 33 and a third centimeters an hour, 216 days at end meter a day, 2,136 meters in all. One circuit at the end of a circular, one circuit at the cellar at ground level, one on the first gallery, half on the second, and on the 267th morning, daylight in the decanting room, independence exists, so called.